along here to speak to you today to tell you a little bit about where our heads are in relation to big society, and particularly the links between big society and local economies. And that's, I think, something that's perhaps not being talked so much about to date. Just to give you an idea of who CLES are, I know many of you will know us, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, based in Manchester, one of the few think tank type organisations based outside of London, something that we're very proud of. We were set up in 1986 by local authorities in the North West in order to make their voice heard at a central government policy making level. And our focus then, as now, was on economic development and regeneration. And we do a range of different things. We've still got a membership base of local authorities, private and social enterprise. We do a range of publications, we do training and events. We do our own research to inform the sector. We've done a lot of research recently on procurement and the role that can play in local economies, how we plan for some of the challenges in the future, such as environmental change and an ageing population. And we've also got a consultancy as well, which allows us to be self-financing. And I suppose you could call us a social enterprise in the spirit of big society even. We've also recently have been working with New Star, and New Start magazine, many of you will know New Star, is now part of CLES, and we'll be working with them to ensure that we still produce the digital magazine and that we also develop a new service in the new year for New Start subscribers. So I just thought I'd mention that there because I know some of you may have heard it, and it's important just to clarify what that relationship is. So that's just a little bit about CLES. And for CLES, we've been really interested in the evolution of big society and what it actually means on the ground. And I guess as well what it means for the function of local government and what the role of local government is in the future, and how, I suppose, does economic development and regeneration respond. And there's already a lot of questions out there at the minute about what is the future for economic development and regeneration, what's going to happen to supporting communities that are most deprived, what's going to happen to all the good work that's been done over the last sort of 10 years or so, and how do we respond proactively in a way to ensure that those communities get the support they need. So I think it ties in a lot with the discussions that we've been having in CLES. And so what is the big idea? What is the big society? And I'm not going to labour too much on this because I think Francis has outlined a lot of the thinking behind it very well. But the two posters on the right-hand side are really the first time I came across big society. And it was as a kind of balance to society, if you like. There's no such thing as, there is such thing as society, sorry. It's just not the same as the state. Big society, not big government. And it really kind of demonstrates where the Conservatives and the coalition government have been coming from in relation to this agenda, about getting the balance of government right between the size and influence that government both at a central and at a local level, about taking responsibility, about passing power to communities, about fairness and opportunity, and about, of course, reform of public services as well. They're the kind of the big themes that Francis mentioned in his presentation that have come out in all of the information that we've seen to date. I think what's interesting from my point of view, and coming from a local government background, is that the sort of bit uneasiness about it is that it almost portrays the local government's role, or the state's role, if you like, in a negative way. And actually, the state and local government can play a very important role in brokering the best solutions for all members of local communities. And I think that's something that we need to not lose sight of in the current debate around big society. That's just some of the kind of rhetoric that we've heard so far on big society, and again emphasising those big themes of social enterprise, public services, freedom, power to people, and solving problems closer to where people live as well. Interesting sort of localism theme there coming through as well. And I think sometimes, I mean, I was thinking about this last night, sometimes things happen which make you sort of start to think about big society in a much more real way. And last night about 8 o'clock, our electricity went off in our house and in our street, and because basically it's a 1930s semi, and the connection's really dodgy and all the rest of it. And so the electricity goes off, dun dun dun, and the first thing you do is you phone the electricity company and you give them an earful, wah wah wah, and then after you do that, you wait for 2 hours for the little man to come and tell you that they can't fix it, they've got to dig the road up tomorrow, and so you spend the rest of the night practicing your presentation by candlelight. But what it made me think about was our dependence on a central electricity system. And I suppose there's a parallel there with the centralised state that Francis talked about. And perhaps the response shouldn't necessarily be simply phone up the electricity company, get it fixed, and go on as normal, but actually recognise your vulnerability, and maybe, I don't know, maybe we should be clubbing together with the rest of the street and generating our own electricity by renewable sources. Or maybe we should be out there, I should be out there with my 70-year-old neighbour digging up the road before the electricity company come. I don't know, but it's just an interesting parallel, I think, with the debate today about what is big society. Someone else described it at another meeting I was at, where they were saying they've got a big issue with litter on their road. And in the context of big society, should he, A, go out with his neighbours and organise a litter pick to sort out all the litter, pick it up and do a regular kind of rota of litter picking to sort this problem out? Should he, B, call the council, or should he, C, just go out and pick it up himself, forget about it, you know? So it's sort of interesting, it starts to, I think, make you think in different ways about the service that you've got and the challenges that local communities face. So just some sort of random thoughts there from me on how this agenda is starting to influence the situation in my own area. So as we heard from Francis, the government have set out sort of 3 ways to realise big society: through social action, through public sector reform, and through community empowerment. The last one I think is particularly interesting because I think it's not too different to a lot of the work that many of us have been doing in communities for many years. We had community development, and we've had economic development, we've had regeneration. All of these things have talked about empowerment, about passing power, and about building capacity within communities. And I think that work has got to continue. And of course, it's also the work that's under most threat at the current time in an atmosphere of cuts. And that's a big challenge for big society, and how you maintain that support for capacity building, for community development, but also try and balance the books locally. And that's one of the big concerns I have about the agenda. As Francis said, I've called it pilot areas, fallen into the old trap there. But they are pilots, and that we talked about. A second wave of pilots apparently going to be announced soon. Greg Clark's reported to have said it earlier this month, earlier in October. We've got the Big Society Bank, we've got a Big Society Network too, the 5,000 community organisers. And in a nutshell, I suppose, for me, what big society is going to mean is a smaller role for government, whether that's the central government or local government, less money available to do things, perhaps no money in some cases, much more done by non-state organisations, whether they be in the social or increasingly the private sector. More philanthropy and more enterprise, mutual, community enterprise development in localities. And I think that's, for me, what the situation is, and that's what it means for our work in economic development and regeneration. So I suppose the next question is, what is the link with local economies, and why am I standing up here talking about big society? Why am I interested in the role that big society is going to play for local economies and local communities? And I think there's a number of important links that it's worth mentioning. First of all, the support for enterprise and entrepreneurship. That activities such as community development, social enterprise, building capacity, they all can contribute towards greater levels of entrepreneurship and enterprise development in communities. And I think that is the engine that's going to drive our economies in many places, the demand for jobs and identifying where local jobs are going to come from in the future. And that's obviously an important link with big society. If we're developing new enterprise, if we're developing new mutuals, if we're seeing more asset transfer between public to social sector. The second thing is about the circulation of money in the local economy. That local businesses, that community organisations, social enterprises, many of you work in them, tend to spend their money in those localities as well, thereby supporting employment and supporting local services. And we did some research in Manchester looking at the re-spend of money in the economy. We looked at the procurement department, their top 1,000 suppliers, and what we found was that local Manchester-based businesses tended to spend around 50p in the pound of every pound of money they got from the council in their local economy, with local employees or with local suppliers. When you compare that with national suppliers tended to spend around 12p in the pound in the locality. So very interesting, a clear link there. Local businesses, whether they be social, whether they be commercial, whatever you want to call them, they tend to have a loyalty and affiliation with their economy. They tend to employ locally, and they tend to use local suppliers in the supply chain. So that's, I think, a very interesting element of big society for creating those types of organisations, for creating that kind of local entrepreneurship. The third element, which I think is interesting, is the welfare reform. And I think many of us would agree that the post-war welfare settlement is probably past its sell-by date, and we do need to think again about how the welfare benefit system works. And we need to make sure that we address some of the contradictions of the welfare benefit system as well. However, there's a real issue for me in this about the supply of jobs to local economies. That in big society, with the social sector doing more, with private enterprise getting involved, but at the same time a huge contraction of public sector in our areas. Well, where are the jobs going to come from? And how will welfare reform go hand in hand with the creation of those jobs? If we're helping people to get off the welfare benefit trap, well, what are we doing to create jobs for them in the economy that they can go into? And traditionally, particularly in the Northwest, the public sector has played a really important bridging role for people who have been in welfare for many years and need to just want to start thinking about going into alternative employment. And the public sector has played a really important role in that. The fourth thing is about the challenges of economic growth itself. And we've seen in the Northwest over the last sort of 10, 15 years, real economic growth. But that economic growth has, while successful, and we've seen the revamp of many of our towns and cities, it still actually hasn't helped many of the communities that need it most. And there's something not quite right about the way that we're doing economic development, in that some of those communities have never actually got out of the previous recessions of the early 1980s and 1990s. So what are we doing wrong in economic development? And how can big society help with that debate? And I think maybe it's about challenging the centralisation of our economy, if you like, and allowing people the freedom and the opportunity to start up their own businesses, to generate income locally, and to be less dependent on big organisations, whether they be private, increasingly private, or whether they be public. The other thing, I think, which is really interesting for local economies is who's going to do what in future economies. And this is not a new idea. We've had social organisations, we've had commercial sector providers working in our local economies for many years now. It's not necessarily a new thing to think of social enterprise delivering services. We had that through the LAA process for many years, or indeed the private sector. We've seen increasing use of the private sector in all our work. If you think at the moment of the work programme that's been announced by NWB, that's very much a big emphasis on private sector employers, but that was something that we've been getting used to over the last 10 years anyway, so it's not necessarily a new thing. But there is some interesting dynamics there about future economies. There's going to be a lower dependence on the public sector, and that's a key element of the Regional Growth Fund eligibility criteria. And interesting that the Regional Growth Fund is going to be open to private sector, including social enterprises, and to public-private partnerships, but not to the public sector on its own. Very interesting change of direction from the government there, and really forcing the private sector to get into the room to make decisions on local economies, take responsibility, if you like, but also a real emphasis on starting to develop partnerships between public and private sector. So a greater role for the private and social sector. The hope is that creates more competition in the marketplace for public services and therefore drives forward innovation. But there's a question there about level playing field. There's also a question about scale. I think that's really interesting at the minute, about the role that scale is going to play in contracts and commissioning. Is big going to be better, or is small beautiful? And there's a big drive at the minute, I think, at all levels to really achieve huge economies of scale. But I think sometimes, in the rush to make short-term savings, we forget what the costs of poor quality or the cost of longer-term challenges might be, and we need to make sure that we're maximising good value for money, not only in terms of the bottom line, but in terms of the wider policy objectives that we can achieve. And finally, I think we at CLES would say we need a broader conceptualisation of what we mean by local economy, particularly in the context of big society, and how we decide whether it's effective. And we've talked a lot about this recently, particularly our work on resilience, and I'm sure any of you have heard Neil will have heard him eulogising about resilience on many occasions. It's something that we feel really passionately about, and it's encapsulated in this model, what we are calling our place resilience model. And we've piloted it in 8 areas around the UK, trying to test whether what's in our heads actually matches with reality on the ground. And we've had some really interesting feedback from that. But what it basically talks about is the interconnectivity